Looks like we're good to go. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kyle White. I'm the Director of Education here at Cooperatives First. For those who aren't familiar, Cooperatives First is a nonprofit organization based in Saskatoon. We provide support to the four Western Canadian provinces, and our goal is to raise awareness of cooperatives generally and provide support to groups of people who are starting new cooperative businesses. We do all of this through a combination of hands-on support, educational sessions like this one, and through a host of online tools, resources, blogs, podcasts, courses. I'll talk about more of that a little bit later on. I'd like to start our session in a good way. So we'll begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we're located, Cooperatives First's office is located on Treaty 6 territory, which is home of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We acknowledge that this land was not ceded, but that the purpose of the treaties was to ensure the land would be shared. Indigenous people have been cooperating in these territories for thousands of years, and it is through cooperation that all of our communities will continue to thrive. Because we're joined by a variety of people from all over Turtle Island, I invite you to take a moment and acknowledge the people and the ancestors of the place that you call home. Okay, so I'll share my screen with y'all. There we go. Make that full screen. And just so everyone knows, for those who maybe just joined us, we are recording today's session. So everything we cover, all that'll be sent to you here after the meeting, and feel free to share that with your network, with your colleagues, by all means. There we go. All right, so we're talking about building your director orientation plan. I want to be a little bit more interactive today because this is something that comes up pretty regular when we do work with startups, helping build these from scratch, but also when we do work with established cooperatives. We attend lots of co-op events and training, professional development, and the skills that you need around the board table is a hot topic, I would say, at every discussion we have, whether it's talking about financing or governance or making good decisions. How we train our directors directly impacts the outcomes of the decisions they make. So that all really begins with your director orientation plan. In terms of what we're looking at today, I think we'll probably take about 45 minutes to an hour total. I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, we'll see, about some of the core content. I'll share some resources that may be helpful, especially if you're a new cooperative and you're looking for resources for building a director orientation plan or just professional development generally. And then we'll have time at the end if folks have questions. Certainly, if you do have questions at any time during today's session, I'd recommend pop them in the chat. Myself and my colleague Kevin, who's joined us, will monitor the chat. And then at the end, we'll go through and make sure we cover everything, any questions from the chat. And then if you want to save your question until the end and ask in real life, that's also perfectly fine too. But we'll have lots of time for that at the end. Okay, so let's start off. What is director orientation? And I'll ask y'all first, just from folks in the room, does your co-op have a director orientation plan? Let me just launch a poll here. And yeah, let us know. Does your co-op have a director orientation plan? If you do, is it working? Does it need changes? Are you not sure? If you're not part of a co-op or an organization, or you're not serving on a board, you don't have to answer. And with all the polls that we're going to have today, don't feel obligated to answer. This is mostly just for fun, to help start a conversation. And I'm curious, how many organizations dedicate time and resources to this? Okay, so let's in the poll share the results. There we go. Y'all should be able to see that now. The majority, about almost half of folks do have a director orientation plan, but we need to make some changes to it. And that's perfect. That's great. I would say most of the cooperatives we work with, even if they're just a couple days old, they have a very basic orientation plan. And I'll touch on what's maybe included in that. But it's one of those things that probably shouldn't be static. Your director orientation plan should evolve. Your co-op, the market you operate within, your competitors, all of that changes. Nothing stays the same, right? And so the training people get should be somewhat continuing. So good to hear that folks are recognizing that, yeah, there's a need to change and update maybe. Okay. One more poll. And so I think most folks who are here probably represent a board. We'll relaunch poll. I think most people represent a board, but in your organization, who delivers your director orientation? And with this one, you can choose multiple answers. I know for a lot of our startups, they're completely volunteer run. And so the only people who are doing all the work really are other board members. And so there's often a peer-to-peer, a collegiality, so to speak, that goes into director orientation, director training. I'll just wait a few more seconds for those last respondents. Okay, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's take a look at those results. So yeah, as you can see, most folks in this room, director orientation is delivered by other board members or the officers being the president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. That shakes out, I would say. Again, most cooperatives are small organizations and even big ones. I would say there's a really important role for that peer-to-peer learning, that mentorship, that coaching from more senior directors to junior directors. Without question, I would say staff have to play a role. If you do have staff, they're going to be closer to the work that the cooperative does usually than the directors. And so imparting some of that knowledge will help directors excel in their role. Contracted service providers, consultants, professional development trainers, your industry or co-op associations, lots of organizations like that are going to have great materials. I would say like cooperatives first, we would probably fit into the contracted service provider or industry association would be my guess. And if any of y'all do use our materials for director orientation, I am flattered. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit more. What is director orientation? Very simply put, it is a training program aimed at supporting learning among the board of directors. That's what it is. It's important, I would say, to think of it as a formal process, something that has steps or stages or some continuity rather than a single process. I probably don't need to tell y'all this, but serving on a board and being equipped with all the skills and know-how and prospective challenges that you will face cannot be learned in a single day. You're not going to go to one conference and walk out ready to go for all challenges. And I say this also fully knowing that many organizations do not have a director orientation plan. And that's okay. That's okay. I'll touch on why that's okay in a moment when we talk about expectations and what standard we need to be held towards. But I would say for our organizations to perform as best as they can, we need some sort of formal process and some genuine learning that goes into this. Most director orientation plans are a combination of things that we probably already do. For those who said, no, we don't have a director orientation plan, I guarantee your new board members have done some of the things we'll touch on. Most director orientation plans include some self-directed learning. So that might be seeking out webinars like this one, where you learn about co-ops, you learn about how organizations work, you learn how to read financial statements. It might be a bit more unstructured. You might have a budget that goes into that. There might be some element of coaching. Again, that peer-to-peer learning, that collegiality and mentorship is really important. The first board of directors I joined, I was probably, I think, 22. And I learned a lot from the president at the time. I attended my first meeting, and then I spent another couple of hours with him at his house. We went through some of the documents of the organization. We talked about process. We talked about the culture of the organization. We attended the next meeting. I spent more time with them, just asking follow-up questions and kind of like learning as we're going. And in my experience, that's most organizations. They kind of, there's not a formal process per se, but when someone new comes on, they sort of job shadow while doing the job of running the organization. And that's perfectly fine. If that works, that's perfectly fine. I would say maybe there's a few more things we could be doing, and I'll touch on those in a bit. And then, of course, reviewing key documents. Obviously, if you get hired at any job, you kind of need to read up on the company. How does it work? What products does it offer? What's the organizational structure look like? What do the policies entail? The same is true for board of directors. If you're going to run an organization, if you're going to oversee the work of a company, you need to know the foundation of that company. So simply reviewing documents is something that most organizations do when they onboard a director, and that's a valid part of a director orientation plan. In some cases, and I would say this is definitely not universally true, there may be some professionalism to it. Lots of organizations will pursue accreditations. Certainly the Institute of Corporate Directors, the Governance Professionals of Canada, our colleagues at the Canadian Center for the City of Cooperatives, those all offer specific designations, and some boards make it a requirement that you obtain a designation to serve on their board. That's great. You'll learn lots in those. You'll probably have, it's a good networking experience as well. They are expensive. And so for many cooperatives, that's really not a reality. Is being able to afford something like the ICD certification. There are some free resources. I'm very happy to say that all of our stuff online is free. And so I'll point to a few more resources you can use at the end that are created by professionals and are pretty good. Okay, so that's what a director orientation plan is. Why? Why do we need one? Again, I've alluded to this a little bit. You need to educate people. I think for any board, if you're bringing on members, it's reasonable to assume that they've either one, never served on a board before, and two, and this is almost a certainty, they've never served on a co-ops board before. And that basis should really inform what your director orientation plan looks like. It's perfectly fine to have some redundancies. Again, I think most of us on this call have served as a director on a board before, but you've probably not served on this board for this cooperative before. And so you need to bring people up to speed. You need to ensure people understand the basis for the cooperative, how cooperatives work, how they're different from other organizations, and that they have the skills for sitting around that table. I would say professional development is something that should be a continuing process. And so getting a good orientation provides a foundation for that. There's some really great resources out there for directors. Most of them will assume certain baseline knowledge. And so a director orientation plan should really equip people with the basics. A good orientation plan also ensures some sustainability for the organization. It ensures that knowledge isn't lost. And this is true for any company. Organizations that rely heavily on one or two key performers should always ask themselves, what if those people quit or if they die? What happens? For a board of directors, they need to ensure that the organization can continue beyond those who are around the table today. And ensuring that there's a good orientation plan to equip those here today, as well as those who will be here tomorrow, is essential for preserving that organization, preserving that knowledge around the board table, and making sure that the co-op can live beyond those who are directors today. So what's the timeline for orientation? If you're a new board member, what are you signing up for in terms of learning? Generally, I would say a director's orientation will kick off immediately following their election. So usually that's in the AGM. You know when your co-op's AGMs are, when the elections take place. Usually I would say they start right away. At a minimum, I would say if you have a formal plan, and by formal plan, I just mean a document with a prescribed pathway, that should probably take about 1 to 3 months to do. And that includes a combination of reading the co-op's, founding documents, some policies, the minute book, getting an idea of the board culture, attending 1 or 2 meetings to get a vibe for how things work, understanding how you can participate, maybe going through some formalized training, some webinars, some sessions, maybe some staff-led discussions, as well as some engagement with other board members who've been on the board a little bit longer. I would say taking, 3 months or so to do that is quite reasonable. The first board I ever sat on, that was probably the window. I think I joined in May of that year, following at the AGM, and then by the fall, I was pretty well brought up to speed. I wasn't really in the learning stage anymore. For lots of organizations, they'll do a bit more. Particularly if your co-op is only meeting quarterly. Certainly if your co-op is an employer and maybe has some budget for more formal training, you might lengthen that process a little bit and just give people the grace to pit in and learn and ensure that, come the end of 6 months, when you join discussions fully, you're fully equipped, you're ready to go, you're brought up to speed. And then for other organizations that are bigger and have bigger budgets and can maybe contract or partner professional organizations or ensure that directors have a designation at the end of it, those can take 6 months, 2 years, quite a while to complete. And that's less so an investment in the minimum requirement, but more so an investment in continuous learning. And again, that's not essential, I wouldn't say. It's a nice to have, not a need to have. So if your organization is small and you can't afford professional designations, don't worry. You'll be just fine without it. And so I say you don't need these things. They're nice to haves. You can do continuing education for free. There are oodles of organizations like Cooperatives First that make tons of information freely available. There's plenty of organizations whose newsletters you can sign up for free. The Governance Professionals of Canada is one of the ones I follow pretty closely. They share lots of great resources. Our friends at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives, they're always releasing new and fascinating studies. Simply reading that, understanding governance trends, understanding new best practices and new ideas, and how different organizations go through different challenges. That's all really valuable learning that you can then bring to your own cooperative and your own board discussions. As your co-op grows, I would say consider some budgetary allocations. It's worthwhile. There's lots of free stuff around governance and planning and how to read financials and such. If you can afford hiring an expert on things like strategic planning, that's something that like is really worth investing in. Going through a session, going through a process, learning some important skills, things that'll really help your co-op excel in those key areas. That is worth investing in over the time as budgetary considerations permit. Okay, so we'll touch on the actual what a director's orientation plan will look like. A big part of that is going to be your objectives. And the objective for a director orientation plan is the why you're creating this. What's the purpose? What's the goal? What do we hope to get out of our director orientation? What's the end goal? And I would say boards everywhere need to ask themselves what is expected of our directors. And here, right away, I'll say moderate your expectations a little bit. Because all the co-ops we work with at Cooperatives First start as working boards. And many cooperatives will stay that way. About half of co-ops in Canada do not employ people. And so their board of directors doesn't just oversee the work, they do the work. And as a board, it's important to be upfront and transparent with what people are signing up for in terms of their duties. It's also very important to be mindful of how much time you're requesting of people. If you are requesting people, do things like shovel the snow, sweep the floors, file the annual return, keep track of, financial reports, be mindful that they might not have the time to do that much training. Do it as you can, but be mindful of people's time. If you're up and running and you're a policy board and maybe you have, a retainer for directors or a per diem for attending board meetings, it might be a bit more reasonable to expect that people will show up for training, to ensure that people have the time to invest in enhancing their skills for the benefit of the co-op. But again, that comes with growth, and as a co-op matures, it's likely more able to fund different things and recruit people who can have that time and hire staff to alleviate some of the work that a board has to do. So be mindful of the situation you're in. You do not need to do everything. Being realistic is one of the biggest tips I'll give to our clients. Don't necessarily compare yourself to the federated co-ops of the world, or the Solio groups of the world. If you're a small housing co-op or a childcare co-op, focus on the task at hand. You can always build these things down the road when your workload gets lighter. But at the end of the day, you do need to ask, what do directors need to know? And what's a need to have versus a nice to have, because you do want to make sure that everyone around the table understands their responsibility and the bare minimums they need to meet. So let's hear from y'all. What are some of those things included in your director orientation plan? This is a multiple choice, so you should be able to select all that apply. Obviously, I didn't catch everything here. Any number of things could be included in an orientation plan. Okay, we'll give it another maybe 15 seconds or so. Eight, 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, we can call it there. I appreciate y'all sharing your insights here. Okay, so as you can kind of see from this review of co-op documents, right? I would consider that the minimum. If you're joining a board, read the bylaws. right? Read the policies, check out the minute book, understand what is the basis of the organization. After that one, it looks like self-directed learning was number two. Perfect. That's great. If you're a small organization and you don't have budget for this, it's perfectly fine. Go find a course or a webinar on board governance. Go find some stuff on how to read financials. There's good stuff out there, and a lot of it's free. That's perfectly fine. Co-op specific education, I'm really happy to see that. I also recognize that most people, or a lot of people here, aren't part of a cooperative, so that's perfectly fine. But if you are, I would say do some co-op specific education with folks. It doesn't hurt to refresh and be mindful of the nuances and how a co-op is different. Um, and then it is also good to see we've got some folks here who do lean on our academic institutions or professional certifications. Or if you're part of a credit union, you might access the training from Credit Union Central. Or if you're part of a cooperative retailer, you might lean on the cooperative retail system for some training. That's fantastic. Coaching, internal training, all that is really, really good. All right. Okay, let's keep moving forward. All right. Whoop, there we go. Okay. So within a director orientation program, I would say this here makes up your minimums. When you sit down at the board table and you start making decisions, very quickly you're going to touch on all of these. So having at least a cursory knowledge in these areas is essential for everyone on the board of directors. Do you need to be an expert? No. Do you need to know enough to train somebody else? No. Do you need to know enough to feel comfortable with voting on a decision? Yes. Whatever it takes to get you to that point, that's really what your training needs to entail. Understanding how your co-op works, understanding how a board and an organization works, understanding what a fiduciary duty means and how you fulfill it, having a general sense of the industry that you work in, being able to read a balance sheet, an operating statement, and a cash flow statement, understanding the contents of the contract with your manager or a service provider, knowing what a strategic planning is and how this strategic plan that you have, hopefully, translates into action. Understanding how your co-op works and how it's different from, say, another organization. And then I like to add board culture because it's what changes a normal board to a fun board or a board that's enjoyable to be a part of. Understanding how y'all want to work together, and how this board of directors can be a team that's moving in the same direction. That's a really nuanced conversation that boards should be having about how they make decisions, how they interact, how they speak with each other, and what kind of culture they want to curate. That's something that I think is it just elevates things a little bit for boards. So I would say these are your key knowledge areas. A director orientation plan should include something that ensures people are brought up to speed to where they're comfortable voting on decisions with respect to this. So someone joins your board, they just got elected, they're what's the phrase, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to dive in. Day one, what do they need to be doing? I would say it's those things. Start with understanding your co-op. Review the articles, review the bylaws. If you have a strategic plan, walk them through the most recent iteration and explain the direction the cooperative is heading in, explain why that is. Review the minute book and any board policies. Understand the starting point that you're joining the co-op with. Have a discussion about the organizational structure, the logic behind that, Again, cooperative governance is really unique. The user ownership aspect of the model, um, the various stakeholders who are involved. It's really important to understand how all those come together and how the board navigates that system, and operationalizes that in their day-to-day. Help directors understand that. And then again, if you're hopefully you've got a cursory knowledge of the industry where you're working in, but I actually wouldn't expect that. If you're, a newly elected director for a co-op retailer, I'd be shocked if you worked in a grocery store, for example. So help people understand, you're going to see a lot of terms in whatever industry you're working in. Help them understand those terms. What does it mean? What does your gross margin mean? What does EBITDA mean? Help them understand all those things so that you're setting them up for success. That's, I would say, day one, start working on these things. And amongst those things, instead of just reading, there's unwritten work. There's the soft skills you pick up. Again, for every new director who joins your board, it's worth identifying someone who's a little bit more senior, a little bit more well-versed, who understands the history of the co-op, who can coach them along, who can provide a little bit of mentorship, where they know they can come to you and ask questions, help mentor that next generation of your co-op's leaders. Simply observing is really helpful. Maybe your first board meeting or your first two board meetings, you're a little bit more quiet. You want to get the vibe, see how things work, see how the minutes get taken, see how motions get made, and just get a feel for the board culture. Observing is really helpful. A couple of co-ops that we've worked with do things really interestingly. So joining a board of directors can be a big step, right? Especially if people aren't well versed with board governance. They might not be ready to take on the role of a director. So lots of our cooperatives will establish committees that allow for a combination of directors and members to carry out some of the work of the co-op. Lots of our childcare co-ops do this. And so that's a really good stepping stone. Get involved with the committee, help make some decisions. Maybe it's focused on fundraising or marketing or membership. Get a feel for how that works, how some of the reporting mechanisms work, how the decision making works. Maybe you'll learn Robert's Rules of Order if that's how you want to do things. But yeah, doing some committee work can be a good stepping stone for wetting your toes and getting a feel so that maybe eventually you'll feel more comfortable taking on the role of a director. Other cooperatives, and I think Riverbend Co-op here in the Davidson Outlook area does this. They have a program where members who are interested in potentially joining the board will take part in a program where they become an ex officio member of the board. They don't vote. They're just an ordinary member who takes part in what the board does. So they attend meetings, they might give some input. They don't have a vote, but they learn the ropes. And then that next year, they'll go up for nomination and they can join the board more formally. That's a really great way. If people, you want to orient people before they're fully part of it, consider doing something, like that, a little bit of like pre-training, to make sure that there's both a good fit with the board and the board culture, and that people are kind of brought up to speed even before they've joined the board. It's a valuable investment in your co-op's members. And a few times now I've said manage expectations. And there's budgetary reasons for this, but a much more real sense is, the members of your board are just people. You can only ask so much of them. And generally speaking, the standard for the decision-making capacity and knowledge level that a person should bring to the board table is whatever is considered reasonable. And so, and this has, been played out in case law in the courts in Canada and the US, and a lot of our legislation speaks to this. When someone comes to a board meeting, you should be able to provide input to the same level as any other reasonable person. Now, if you have a specific education, If you've got a specific lived experience, you are bringing that to the table as well. And so if you're a lawyer and you're coming to the board, well, you should be acting the way a reasonable lawyer would be acting, or a reasonable accountant would be acting. If your CEO is committing some kind of fraud and they're really sophisticated and they're a financial expert, none of you are, right? It's unreasonable for you to expect you to find every single little issue and respond to it effectively. That's not reasonable. We want to be able to get people up to the point where they know how the co-op works, know how board governance works, be able to read and understand the information they're given, and vote based on their own judgment. That's what's reasonable, and that's the expectation we need to get people up to. Now, if you want to go above that, you can. There's lots of cooperatives and other organizations that up the standards for who can run for the board. Mountain Equipment Co-op famously did this back in 2013. You needed, I think you needed experience as a senior management in a complex organization to be recommended by the for election. And so you can certainly do that, and you certainly raise the standard for who will be around the board table. Spoiler alert, it didn't matter for MEC. They're no longer around today. And so, you can do those things, but they don't always ensure the results you might be seeking. And as you're creating your director orientation plan, try and track some of this progress. If nothing else, ensure that people are reading what they're supposed to do. They're doing the work that's been assigned to them. In a previous webinar, and you can access this through our website, we did a session on board evaluations and one on board recruitment. And both of those kind of hit the same thing where, it's important to understand the competencies around the board table. So check in regularly. I would say at least doing a brief thing annually and a more formal thing every couple of years is helpful for ensuring that you've got the skills around the table that you need for people to be successful. And then with that information, you can maybe amend your orientation plan. You can maybe seek out some supplemental training, all of course within, budgetary constraints. Or, I don't know, slap someone on the wrist and say, hey, you need to do some more learning on XYZ. But hopefully people are good about it and do the work that's been assigned. Okay, so I mentioned budgetary constraints a few times. If you're not comfortable answering this, you don't have to. But what is the budget your co-op has for director orientation? If you're comfortable with sharing, please do. This is anonymous as well. I have no idea who's answering what. So we got quite a few options, and this is a per director answer. Okay. It's fun watching these come in. They're so interesting. All right. Maybe 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2. Okay. We'll call it there, share the results. All right. So what do we think? Most people said either 0, none, or no formal allocation. I kind of read the distinction there as none, as we can't afford to pay for orientation or training. Whereas no formal budget allocation maybe means we can pay for stuff, but it's not a line item. That's kind of how I interpret the differences there. So I hope I should maybe clarify that beforehand, but that's kind of my take on those two. And yeah, this is kind of what I expected. Again, most people here I think are involved in small organizations and startups. And so probably don't have a ton of money to be allocating towards corporate training. I do see a few folks who are here from larger organizations that can invest a bit more per director. That's great. If you have that money and you can access those good resources, that's fantastic. We want our co-ops to be as successful as possible, and training is a good part of that. But again, for those smaller organizations, you can still do a lot with not a lot of money. Hey. Okay, so let's get into building your plan. We've kind of talked about what it is, how long it takes, some of the objectives. Oh, I took a lot longer than 20 minutes already. Well, here we are. Okay, so you're building your plan. And I would say don't overthink it. A director orientation plan maybe sounds like a fancy way of describing 2 or 3 pages, right? We have an employee orientation program here at Cooperatives First that all of our staff who are new go through. It's a couple of pages. It just points to different resources, key things, key competencies that you need to come away with to help you be successful in your role. That's really what we're talking about here. I would say it's helpful if you can identify what those competencies are so people know what they're working towards, clarify the timeline, and set out those expectations of people so people know what it is they're doing, what they're working towards, how long it'll take, and they can make some progress. From there, set out what that program is. And you guys know your organizations better than I do. But yeah, I would make recommendations. So identify the documents people need to review, make them available to directors. Identify what's guided, what's maybe peer-to-peer, what's led by staff, what's on your own to pursue. Identify the formal coursework or the sessions, providing links to key resources that you think is good is really helpful. Those can be both internal, maybe developed by your own cooperative for people, or external, provided by organizations like us or academic institutions or professional associations. And in some cases, there might be a good opportunity to partner. I know our colleagues at the Canadian Center for the Study of Cooperatives at USask, they have a partnership with the Cooperative Retailing System. I think they partnered with the Bee Made Honey Producers Cooperative. They've partnered with a couple of credit unions. And so they have a director development program, and people will work through that. I think it takes about a year to complete all of that, and it gets you a certification. We have some free stuff online. We have a course called Co-op Professionals, which gives a pretty good introduction to what a cooperative is, how it's different, how membership, governance, operations work, and how it's a bit different. And we use some real life case studies for folks to work through. Your plan should also assign who does what. Again, most of you mentioned that directors are the most involved in orientating new directors. And so, mentorship is probably a big part of that. If you do have staff, note what staff presentations are going to take place. And then if needed, you could certainly contract external service providers, be that a consultant, your co-op association, a professional association, or an academic educational institution. I mentioned off the hop, these things aren't set in stone. Things should be changing, they should be evolving. And I would say, when should you create one of these? Right away. Day one. When you work with us and you get your incorporating documents back, there's some of the first things that your first directors need to be reading. We recommend going through sessions like this. We've got a lot of great resources in our webinars where you can get a rundown on board duties, on how to read financials, and what an AGM looks like, all those sorts of things. You can begin working on those right away. Okay, and then I'll just point to a couple of resources that I find quite helpful. So I've mentioned these few right away. The Canadian Center for the Study of Cooperatives has a really fantastic program. I've appeared as a guest lecturer a few times in their advanced cooperative governance program. It is really, really helpful. It's one of the best programs I've ever gone through that focuses on co-op specific governance. And it really pays good attention to the nuance of how cooperatives work differently. The Governance Professionals of Canada is who I've done a lot of my formal training with. They provide a really good combination of interactive coursework, one-off sessions, and they have a lot of recordings. And so if you want to go and access some good professional content on a budget, reviewing past webinars, you'll get really good info from GPC. Certainly, the Credit Union Association is a great trainer for credit unions. And then, depending on what province you're in or what industry you work in, you may have a co-op sector or association that can also provide really good resources. Here at Co-operatives First, we maintain coopcreator.ca. And some of the things that we provide for free, you can find through this QR code, are some of these here. So being a board member, your board directors, different templates. It's a good way to find tools or resources just to get up to speed on how things are going to be phrased or worded and created around the board table. If you want to do a deeper dive, we've got a bunch of online courses. I know a lot of co-ops and credit unions right now are going through our Indigenous Awareness course. It's really designed for co-op leaders who want to learn more about Indigenous peoples and ensure that we have that knowledge when we do our work as cooperators. But I would definitely recommend, and that's what this QR code links to, is the Co-op Professionals course. So it's a 5-module course. You could easily knock it out in an afternoon. That gives you a really good overview of what it means to be involved in a co-op. That's one I would recommend if you're looking for a free resource. And if you like this style of learning, with someone talking a lot and some questions, we have a whole bunch of recorded webinars, and you can find those through this QR code. And they cover some of the things that you need to know, right? How to read financial statements, what your director duties include, the things that kick off at financial year end, minute keeping or meeting minutes, record keeping, those sorts of things. They're not, super exciting, sexy topics, but it'll help bring you up to speed pretty quick on what you need to know and what you need to be doing as a member of the board. And they're free, of course. And to that end, our next session, if you'd like to have a bit of a slightly elevated discussion, we'll call it. Our next session that I'm leading is on Wednesday, May 20th. It's 5 things your board can do to elevate your co-op's governance. A couple of practical tips for co-ops that want to maybe step up their game a little bit and try and perform a little bit better. What are some things to consider, some best practices that we've learned from other organizations? That QR code takes you to the registration page. Okay, that's all from me. We're going to go into the chat here in a second to answer any questions. But if folks do need to run, I totally understand. If you want to get in touch, there's my email address, kyle@cooperativesfirst.com. If you want to hear from us more, we do have a quarterly newsletter where we promote lots of tools and resources, our coursework, and upcoming webinars. And that's what that QR code will link to. Hey, but all right, let's dive into the Q&A.
So I think Susan was asking about the CCSC program.
So the Center's governance program is offered in modules. I want to say it's 3 modules. They space them out quite a bit, and that's why it takes about a year to complete. I think it takes a year. The one I joined does 4 modules over, I think, 5 weeks. So 1 day per week, plus some content to review. Very, very manageable, I would say. And we meet, I think, for 2 or 3 hours once per week.
And I think Susan answered Mark Smith's question. Director orientation versus director onboarding. I think that was answered in the chat.
Yeah.
And then a question from James here.
Yeah. Hey, so James says some of the education we offer is for for-profit co-ops. Are there any tools for not-for-profit co-ops? Um, I maybe don't make too much of a distinction. Many of the challenges that are interpersonal in nature, or somewhat even competitive, are the same. Um, we do have a couple of case studies that are based on not-for-profit co-ops, or co-ops that don't remit profits anyway, but still have, things like competitors. We don't at the moment. I don't think we have case studies per se that are based around housing or childcare co-ops. That is something we're planning on doing. Um, but I would say a lot of the content that we cover can be applicable to both, in terms of the roles, and responsibilities that people take on when they join a co-op. Um, oh, I see Susan asked about the cost to a program. I would have to double check. Um, yeah, I'm not 100% sure. There is a cost to the director development program that the center offers. It is more than free, but yeah, it's certainly. Oh, and apparently they have free ones. Okay. Um, how can we locate that free course? Kevin's provided a link in the chat for anybody who's interested or didn't catch the QR code for the co-op professionals course as well. And also, if folks have questions, by all means, feel free to raise your hand or just hop on. If you want to ask your question, please do fire away. Ooh, director orientation versus director onboarding. I do see somebody answered that. Um, yeah, I've kind of been using, I would say in this session, orientation and onboarding somewhat interchangeably. It's not uncommon to refer to an event as an orientation session. Um, but yeah, I'm not really making much of a distinction between those two. You're training people in the basics. What do they need to know to be a part of the directors, to be a part of the board? Okay, looks like those are the questions. Housing co-op here. We had a near complete business shutdown a year ago and full board turnover to go with it. Really appreciate your presentation. I'm glad you joined us, Dwayne. And I should say too, I mean, for housing cooperatives, it's one of those sectors that is pretty well served. The Housing Co-op Federation of Canada does provide a number of resources. They have a conference annually. They put out a lot of good information. There are regional housing co-op associations, and then some folks like James here, who's just a wealth of knowledge that can also be, I think, approached about doing some work with housing co-ops, to provide some training. So if there is like a full board turnover, there are good resources out there to help get you up to speed. Okay. Any other questions from folks? Hearing none, going once, going twice. All right. If folks do have questions, by all means, feel free to reach out. You have my email, you've got our phone number. If you want to talk, we would love to hear from you. Otherwise, it's been really nice connecting with folks. I hope to see you on May 20th at the next webinar. If not, have a wonderful day. I hope our paths cross again soon. Take care, y'all.